Well, welcome everyone to Straight Science. Straight Science is an evening science presentation put on by UAF Northwest Campus and UAF Alaska Sea Grant. Here in Nome, we are both Northwest Campus and Alaska Sea Grant. We are public servants of the Bering Strait region, which is the homeland and waters of the Yupik, Inupiaq, and St. Lawrence Island Yupik peoples. So tonight, I'm glad everyone could join. We're kind of sitting here watching the weather all day and know that we've lost power several times today rather quickly. It came back on. But if we do lose power, hang on and try to climb back on, because we've got this linked in with Juno. So if we fall off, Bob Foy will continue and we can all jump back on. So Bob Foy was trying to get here, and we should commend him for that, because everything kind of turned against him here. He was trying to get here to be in person, and he had a gang with him. There was the communication manager, Maggie Mooney-Seuss, for the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, and thank you, Susan. And there was Mabel Baldwin-Schaeffer, the Alaska NOAA Tribal Research Coordinator. And unfortunately, they're going to try to reschedule. And so they were good sports to deal with this weather. Kind of like, honestly, other than the post office, I can't think of anyone who's tried so hard. Neither sleet nor snow nor rain nor dark or light of night has stopped these guys. So well done, Bob Foy and the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. So the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, what is that? So know that on Straight Science and in the region, we've often seen folks that are involved with the ice seal aerial surveys or the beluga whale surveys, or we had the right whale people on talking about right whales. And we, of course, always have Bob's Lyle Britt and Dwayne Stevenson with NOAA Race Division, and all that those guys have done to talk about the bottom trawl surveys. Well, that's just a small piece. All those little pieces are a small piece of what the Alaska Fisheries Science Center does. And Bob Foy tonight is here to talk to us. He is the boss of it all. He's the director of NOAA Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center, which we're going to learn more about tonight, and is sort of broadly all over the place. And after that, we will really be grateful for the time that Bob Foy is giving us here tonight to sort of tell us what's happening next, and also reaching out kind of as our future is rapidly changing. And we look forward to hearing more. With that, Bob Foy, thank you so much for coming to Straight Science and talking to the Bering Strait region. Take it away.
Yeah, good evening, Gay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Gay. To you, UAF Straight Science is such an incredible opportunity for folks in the region to hear lots of science and lots of perspectives. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to address everyone this evening. I was really hoping to be back in Nome, and it's too bad we couldn't make it. We've actually rescheduled 2 or 3 times now since this last fall. We will reschedule. It looks like maybe we'll shoot for April at this point, but we will try to get back up there. And by we, I mean my co-authors in this presentation, as Gabe mentioned, Maggie Mooney-Seuss, Mabel Baldwin-Schaeffer. And our goal to come to the community, we've got folks from the Alaska Fisheries Science Center that are in the community all the time, but our goal in particular was to talk about how we can better represent the communities in Northwest Alaska, how we can better serve the communities in Northwest Alaska by understanding what kind of research that we can be doing to help with climate resilience, with the community resilience to the changes that we're seeing in the region, to bring a stronger Indigenous perspective into our research portfolio. So this is really part of a multi-prong approach to visit a number of different communities. We were in Kotzebue a few weeks ago. We'll be in Utqiagvik in a few weeks. We will be back in Nome, I promise, and hopefully we can make that out to other villages as well as some of the other areas in the Bering Sea region. So part one, stay tuned. We will be back. My goal this evening is to give an overview, is to talk a little bit about what the Alaska Fisheries Science Center is, who are we, what are we responsible for, and then talk a little bit about all the changes we're seeing. We are obviously experiencing climate change like no other place on the planet, and you all know that. Not only is it usually a highly variable place, for instance, look out your windows, but we are seeing quite a bit of change in the region with respect to heat waves, with respect to general warming, and all the responses that come with that in the ecosystem, both the physical ecosystem, looking at sea ice and winds and how that affects your communities directly, as well as, and what I'm mostly focused on, food security. Thinking about the subsistence species, thinking about the fisheries that occur offshore. So our goal is to try and work with you and identify what research that we should be conducting.
I'm glad.
So
oh,
next slide, and yes, I'm running my own slides.
yeah, no, thank you for that. There's a lot going on back here.
No worries. Having said that, there it is. Okay, so a little bit about who we are first. So this can be confusing, and it's almost not fair for a community to just understand the different parts of the government that come into your communities. And I'm only going to show one. It took me years working for the government to figure out the different entities, but this is just showing a picture of the Department of Commerce. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, is inside the Department of Commerce. Inside NOAA, you have the Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, OAR, with scientists that are in the state of Alaska. We've got our satellite service in Alaska. The National Marine Fisheries Service, that's the entity that I work for. You've got the Ocean Service. You've got the National Weather Service and OMAO, the Office of Marine and Aviation Operations. That's the entity that has the white, large NOAA ships. So all of these, this whole group here, give me a second, I'm gonna find my pointer, my laser pointer. There we go. You should be able to see this pointer now. So all of these groups in this middle part are all part of NOAA. Within that, like I said, I am from the National Marine Fisheries Service. Within the National Marine Fisheries Service, we have a region in Southeast United States, the Atlantic region in the United States, the West Coast region in the United States. What it's not showing here is the Pacific Islands, which are also in Fisheries Service. And then you have the Alaska region. But there's more. Within the Alaska region of the National Marine Fisheries Service, you have the Alaska Regional Office and you have the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. The Alaska Regional Office is responsible for the management and some of the fisheries management policies in particular, whereas the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, where I'm the director of, we're responsible for the science and the research. That science and research is collected, analyzed, provided to the managers so that they can better manage, but we're also representing communities who need this information to survive, the different industries that need this information or this science in order to conduct their business. So that's what I'm going to speak about today, is this lower left-hand corner here. Especially if I can get the slide to move. Okay, here we go. So this is the Alaska Fisheries Science Organization. And why do I put this up? I just wanted to give you a flavor for the kinds of work that we do at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. As Gay pointed out, you have lots of different engagements with people from the Alaska Center. We have our administration, which you would expect in order to run our programs. But the programs here, the different divisions that we have in particular are the ones that you may know. Aka Bay Laboratories is located in Juneau, and they're a mix of survey, assessment. Our genetics program is here. So for those who follow some of the salmon issues, all the genetics work on salmon issues comes out of the laboratory in Juneau. Some of the Gulf of Alaska stock assessment work, our long line survey for some of the deeper species is all conducted out of that location, that division. We also have our Fisheries and Monitoring Division. These are the observers. These are the observers that we put out on the commercial vessels to track the catch, to better understand the catch, and to track the bycatch as well. So for instance, in the Bering Sea region, we have 100% coverage. We send observers on 100% of pollock boats, for instance. Some of the bottom trawls, for instance, also have 100% observer coverage. So that all comes out of one of our divisions. We have our Marine Mammal Laboratory. That's a division within the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. So these are the marine mammal scientists that work with the co-management entities, the Ice Seal Committee, the Beluga Whale Committee, as well as some others, in addition to those that are conducting surveys in your region. We have the RACE division that Gay mentioned before, the Resource Assessment and Conservation Engineering division. This is the division that conducts our basic surveys, or basic fish surveys, and our ecosystem surveys. So these have been surveys that have been going for 50 years in the Bering Sea, and where we're conducting assessments on the fish that live on the bottom, as well as the fish that are in the water column, as well as the ecosystem. So looking at the oceanography, looking at the zooplankton, the bugs that feed the small fish, etc. And then lastly, we have our division, our Resource Ecology and Fisheries Management, we call it REFM. That division is responsible for the assessment. So they take all of this data and then turn it into models. Why do we use models? That allows us to predict into the future. We're not great at predicting far into the future, but we can predict into the future what the trends are. Are the fisheries numbers going up? Are they going down? Is the ecosystem changing in a way that we can predict a bit about the directions that it's heading? So we're responsible for all the federal waters. So that's 3 miles out to 200 miles offshore. A huge area, 1.5 million square nautical miles is what we're responsible for. So why is this important, and why does this slide show so many different regions with colors? As most of you already know, each of these regions is extremely different. The Gulf of Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, Bering Sea, the Northern Bering Sea, Chukchi. Then you even get smaller in your region, around the Northern Bering Sea or Southern Chukchi. All extremely different ecosystems. It means that we have to know a lot about each of them. It means we have to spread out our effort into each of these regions to better understand fisheries. We conduct over 24 different surveys. We are very ecosystem focused, meaning our goal is to ultimately understand how the ecosystem functions. And that includes the people, that includes the communities. We're looking at over 250 different fish and crab species, 42 different marine mammal species, and strongly focused on the conservation of protected species in these regions. So where do we have staff? The majority of our staff are located on the main campus, which is located in Seattle, Washington. Also in the lower 48, we have some scientists at the Newport Research Center where they conduct physiological experiments. They have laboratories in seawater where they can better understand the effects of changing temperature and changing conditions on animals in the laboratory. In Alaska, we have the Auk Bay Laboratories in Southeast Alaska. This is where I'm located. We have smaller offices in Anchorage, out in the Pribilofs, in Dutch Harbor, and then another larger research laboratory in Kodiak, where they're also focused on crab species in particular, but there's a seawater laboratory there for conducting experiments. So this picture here, there's a lot going on, and it walks through a lot of the different programs that I just mentioned and the types of research that we're doing. A few I wanted to highlight. Let's start right in the middle, ecosystem modeling. One of our goals is to better understand how do the changes in the ecosystem make their way to the fish and the marine mammals that we're interested in. The storm that you're having in the Northwest Alaska right now, bringing up warmer air, maybe pushing the sea ice out of the region, perhaps affecting the cold pool later on in the season. That all has downstream effects on the food security in the region. That changes the type of plankton that are in the ocean. Sometimes it changes the species. It changes their location. If you have some changes associated with temperature, that can change the entire food web in 1 year, where instead of having large copepods, you have smaller copepods. Copepods are the small animals in the water column that eat the plants. The change in those copepods may change which fish do better as juveniles. That then affects everything that eats those fish. In some cases, we can track that. We can predict some species many years into the future based on the fat content of their prey, or based on the species we see in the plankton. So our goal is to try and identify the bottlenecks in the ecosystem. Where in the ecosystem can we see lots of change that then affects either fish, fisheries, marine mammals? We're conducting a lot of surveys at sea on the ecosystem. We're conducting socioeconomic research. So what does that mean? The economic research is looking at the impacts or the value of fisheries. So the National Marine Fisheries Service main job is to manage fisheries. So there's an economic component to that. How do we maximize the economic component to that while balancing the conservation of those species, while balancing the importance of fish species to the ecosystem, to the communities like yourselves that are living in these regions? And part of that flows into the social science part. How do we measure the effects of fisheries? How do we measure the effects of climate change on communities? That's something that our social scientists are working on in your region. We do our assessments, we look at bycatch, we look at ways to reduce bycatch at all costs. Like I said before, we're monitoring our fisheries, we're monitoring our marine mammals, and then again, we're looking at how the ecosystems function. So what drives us? How do we prioritize our research? I get a lot of questions where people ask, well, why do you do that? Or why don't you work on this? Or why do you have so much focus on that in the Bering Sea instead of something else? We're a federal agency. We're governed by laws. We are defined by the Magnuson-Stevens Act, by the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, among a few others. So those laws define our mission, and they define what the majority of the staff at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center work on. They focus us on the types of research that we conduct and on how we interact with the management in this region. Obviously, our mission is different from other federal agencies and state agencies. The State Alaska Department of Fish and Game has a different focus. The Department of Interior, U.S. Fish and Wildlife has a different focus. Sometimes we're looking at similar species. Most of the time we're looking at completely different species or different areas. So that can also make it difficult understanding, well, which agency am I talking to and how in the heck do I bring my concerns to the federal government, and try and figure out which entity to look for. And that's part of why we're communicating this. So again, our main job, assessing fish, crab, marine mammal stocks, bringing data to managers, and then this last piece here, climate change on marine ecosystems. That's not minor. We have for decades and decades tried to focus on what is changing in the ecosystem. And until recently, we were focused on the ecosystem with pretty small changes, actually. In the background, things were warming up. Every once in a while, you would have an extreme year. But for the most part, our expectation was that the ecosystem would return to something we'd seen before. That's changing. That may be over, where each year is difficult to predict whether we can return to what we saw the year before because of climate change. Climate change is forcing us to reconsider how we manage, what the effects of our management are, because they aren't very predictable, because they change from year to year in a way that suggests that we won't go back to the way it was. On the right hand side here is just a cartoon to show that with all of this information that we're collecting, that we have responsibilities to better understand commercial fisheries, to better understand subsistence fisheries, protected species, ecosystems, and fisheries management. So we work with our partners at the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, which is defined by the Magnuson-Stevens Act as well. So that's the backdrop in what we do. So the next handful of slides, I wanted to just walk through a bit of our research for 2023, in particular in your region. And that'll give me an opportunity to talk about some of our initiatives and some of the work that we're really focusing on in your region, again, given that there's so much change. So this map here just shows a brief understanding of what our focus is with marine mammals in Alaska this year. So you can see these gray diamonds. This represents our passive acoustic recorders. So we have listening devices, if you will, out in the ocean, listening for the different whale songs and whale communications so that we can better understand how they move, when they move, which species are moving through. So you can see this is a pretty complex array of moorings that we have. So that's the majority of what we have going on this year in your region. We also, on the marine mammal side, we're developing future surveys for our ice seal work, which should happen soon. We're working on our large marine mammal and cetaceans, our large marine whales, pardon me, surveys that we expect to occur in the next couple of years, and those would occur in your region as well. You can also see some of the yellows and greens along the coast of the Aleutians and the Gulf of Alaska. Mostly that represents our pinniped work, our focus on stellar sea lions. And then you can see the Pribilof Islands here where we have quite a bit of work going on with fur seals as well. So looking at some of the surveys specifically in your region this year, each year we conduct the Northern Bering Sea Surface Trawl and Ecosystem Survey. So what is the focus of this survey? So the surface trawl is a large mesh rope trawl that allows us to better understand salmon. What we have done with that survey is we've actually gotten to the point where we can predict what's going to happen to the Yukon Chinook salmon about 5 or 6 years in advance. And what that tells us is a lot of the current problems with Chinook salmon on the Yukon are happening at the juvenile stage because we catch them when they're juveniles. So what that tells us, if we can predict something that's going to happen a few years from now, that lets us know that whatever causes that variability from year to year, and unfortunately in more recent years it's been an extreme decline, we can predict that, which means that the conditions that are causing the decline are either happening in the river or they're happening when they're very small juveniles in the estuarine environment in this region. And what other evidence do we have? So on this survey is also an ecosystem survey. And we spend a lot of time better understanding the oceanography, better understanding the plankton community. As I mentioned before, we're looking at harmful algal blooms. We're looking at the diet, the condition and the trophic ecology of fish. What's all that mean? It means we're trying to figure out who eats who. We look at how much fat the fish have, the juvenile fish have. And what we've shown is that for salmon, we have seen a change in their prey with the heat waves. We've seen a decline in the fat content, meaning they're of lower condition, which suggests lower survival as well. We look at something called environmental DNA, eDNA. This is a way that allows us to scoop up a bucket of water, basically. And because all of the animals that are in the water slough cells off into the water, it allows us to see what species are there using molecular tools, using genetics. So that is still being perfected in our laboratories in Juneau. We're also looking at snow crab, which the biomass of snow crab in this region is very high, as well as yellowfin sole. And then also looking at things like shark migration, salmon sharks that we catch during the survey and we return to the sea alive. This is a collaborative program that we've had with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, again, for many, many years. And the state of Alaska is broadening this survey as well into southern portions of the Bering Sea. We also have our bottom trawl surveys. So I'll start with the survey on the right-hand side. This is the bottom trawl survey that we've been conducting for over 50 years. And it might look like a lot of stations, but remember, this is 150,000 square nautical miles. So we do a very short tow every 20 miles in this region. And this allows us to see the distribution of all our bottom species. Most of our fishery species are crab species as well. In more recent years, on the left-hand side, we've had to include the northern Bering Sea as well, as we've seen the decline in sea ice. So we've seen the cod, the pollock, the yellowfin sole species all move north into this region in 2019. They have subsequently mostly moved back into the southeastern Bering Sea, but there's still a lot of cod, for instance, in the northern Bering Sea region. So we're, like I said before, we're looking at abundance as well as looking at the oceanographic data, the ecosystem information, and trying to look at the effects of climate change. So Alaska marine ecosystems are changing, and really, like I said before, this is our goal in coming into the communities and trying to build resilience. And how do we do that? How would NOAA Fisheries do that? With information, with collecting data, with better understanding how communities are interacting with the ocean, with the marine species, but also how they're affected by the decisions we make in the commercial fisheries. Better understanding the variability and the dependence on these ecosystems for food security. All of that plays into creating and developing resilience. And the key here is acknowledging from the beginning that these marine ecosystems are changing. And they're not changing a little bit, they're changing dramatically. And that is something that we're trying to both learn from as well as educate on what we're seeing, and learn from all of you what you're seeing, how your subsistence hunting is changing, how your access to resources is changing, And obviously I'm focused on the marine environment that doesn't even start to speak to some of the changes that you've seen in coastal erosion and the impacts of the changing ocean on your communities directly. So this cartoon here shows a little bit of what we understand about the changes because of the loss of sea ice, because of warming that we've seen in an extreme nature in 2019 and a couple of years prior to that. Um, and changes that we see in the ocean from the surface from the surface to the bottom. So in the Bering Sea, the southeastern Bering Sea, around the Pribilofs, for instance, when you have the plankton, the plant material that responds to the melting ice because of the sunshine in the spring, most of that material is eaten by the small plankton, which is then eaten by the small fish, and then the larger fish, and then the marine mammals. So most of the carbon, most of the food stays in the water column. Most of the food gets eaten and transferred from one part of the food web to another part of the food web. In the northern Bering Sea and southern Chukchi Sea, most of the production that comes from the sun and the plants makes its way all the way to the bottom of the ocean, which is why we have so many invertebrates on the bottom. It's why the snow crab are so plentiful on the bottom. That's changing. That changes with the loss of sea ice. As the sea ice goes away, you see shifts in the ecosystem. Some of those shifts will be to support more fish and animals up in the water column. Some of it will just change species that are in the bottom part of the water column. So that's what this diagram is supposed to show. One of the key pieces in the middle is ice algae. Ice algae, it turns out, it grows on the bottom of the ice, supports an entire community of plankton, which supports an entire community of small Arctic fish species. And obviously all of this then changes and affects the types of fish species that can survive in the northern Bering Sea region, and the migrations of the marine mammals and the availability of food to the marine mammals and the seabirds. So I mentioned before our socioeconomic program. And this just shows a smattering of the social science projects that we're working on in the Bering and Chukchi Seas with the fishing communities. And you see a picture here of Dr. Wise, our social scientist at the center, one of our social scientists at the center. She has been in a number of your communities. And in fact, she'll be in the Nome region here again soon, looking to work with community members. And you'll hear a lot of the same words I've been using, or you'll see here a lot of the same words I've been using. Building resilient pathways from river to sea. So working on understanding the community's dependence on the ocean, but they live up the river. Better understanding those linkages. An oral history project, trying to capture the information that's been passed on from generation to generation orally. How do we make that relevant in the current management of this region? That's something that Sarah's working on and working with you all in your communities in order to do that better, and so that we can better understand and better share that knowledge. Participating in communities specifically linked to Norton Sound red king crab fisheries. So that fishery has been highly variable. It was closed for a couple of years. Luckily, we saw an increase in crab in Norton Sound this past year and some lucrative fisheries. So this is a Strait Science talk that Sarah did on January 18th, talking about how the community is dependent on that fishery. Thinking through inclusion of traditional knowledge in our ecosystem assessments. How do we do that better? How do we do that respectfully? How do we do that in a way that allows us to utilize that information in management? ASEPO, Annual Community Engagement and Participation Overview. Well, it's a mouthful. What does that mean? That's us looking at the changes in communities. How are school programs changing? How are the number of people in communities changing? How are they impacted by availability of fisheries? changing seas, looking at Arctic coastal communities in particular, looking at the northern and southern, the northern Bering and the Chukchi, on the topic I mentioned before, where the ecosystem may be changing from one that's benthic or bottom dominated to one more up in the water column. What's that mean to each of these communities? What's that mean to those of you who depend on these resources for your food every day? So that's one of the goals of our program, or many of the goals of our program. Improving equity in science and improving our management tools. So I mentioned this report here on the left-hand side. This is our annual community engagement participation overview. We're developing indicators of vulnerability. Where are those points in which communities that are dependent on a resource that's changing? And the climate is changing them. Some of them are going away. Some of them are shifting. We're hoping there's also new opportunities as some of the species move into new regions. We were just in Kotzebue a few weeks and talking about how communities may adapt and may continue to be resilient because they'll learn to fish on different species that might be moving into the region. So we're integrating this information from the community also further south with the small commercial fishing communities. There's commercial fishing in Nome that is impacted economically, and that matters to Nome. So it's a community that is dependent on subsistence, that is dependent on economic opportunities, that is dependent on the infrastructure in the community to be sound as these changes are occurring. So again, this is a major focus of our modeling and our ecosystem work. Research engagement. So this is one of the, if we were live, I was going to focus mostly on this slide because this is about Mabel Baldwin-Schaeffer. And Mabel, which from that part of Alaska, is in our Indigenous research coordinator role. And the goal in that position is to, well, we created it acknowledging that we don't have Indigenous perspective within the Science Center. We have a science perspective. We have tried to learn how to better bring traditional knowledge into our programs, but it was clear that without that Indigenous perspective, we were just continually trying. So we hired this position, and it couldn't have come at a more important time given the changes in climate that I mentioned before that you're experiencing in your region. So our goal at this position is to have Mabel working in the communities to identify what is needed in the community with respect to research, to identify what kind of traditional knowledge we should incorporate it into our management decision-making processes, to better communicate and build trust in the communities so that we can, again, better represent, better support as these changes occur. We're also doing our best to engage with students all over the state of Alaska. COVID helped us with this to some extent because it allowed us to focus on digital and online formats. We have our NOAA Live webinar series that we started in 2020. We're connecting to schools and communities all over the state of Alaska on a regular basis. If you don't know what it is, please Google it. If you can't find it, send me an email. I'll put my email and phone number in the chat here. I'd be happy to talk to any of you and pass on information. And in fact, Maggie, if you would do that for me right now in the chat, that'd be fantastic. This is a really great program and we're trying to connect with communities, our K through 8 programs, where we're partnering in particular with Alaska Native organizations, with some specific school districts, and then sometimes just specific schools where there's a teacher that just really wants to engage with NOAA. And we're trying to help them develop culturally relevant curriculum. We're working with high schools, for instance, working with the Sea Alaska Heritage Institute for high school STEM programs, science, technology, engineering, mathematics programs. We're developing summer internship programs and an undergraduate program through a number of different university programs. Our goal is to educate, But our goal is also to build out a workforce that's much more representative of the communities that we're intending to represent. So it's really important that for any of you listening who think that you would like to see the National Marine Fisheries Service look more and have a better understanding for the communities that you live in, that we think about those kids that may be interested in science, that might be interested in the types of programs that we conduct, and get them interested. And that's all I have, Gay. Happy to answer whatever questions may come on a broad and pretty high level set of topics that I just put out there.
All right. Well, I'm absorbing it all. So thank you so much. And now is the time I say to the audience, this is a good time to give Bob Foy a little love in the chat box. It is never easy being a public speaker. And we're really grateful that Bob Foy gave us his time this evening. I guess now, Bob, you can kind of see it's getting a little grayer outside. All right. And while people are forming their questions, I'm going to check with our caller. Priority to the caller. If the caller has a question, unmute and ask. And if for some reason you can't unmute, try the cell phone 434-1149. Or remain silent. That's good too. Any of the audience, excuse me, any of the audience have any questions right off the bat? I know I do. I've got a question. So while you're thinking of your questions, what I can see, I will jump right in there. So Bob, thank you so much. That was a big overview of how extensive NOAA Fisheries, Alaska Fisheries Science Center, which is all the research. And I'm just curious because we see the Fish and Wildlife Service up here, and we're just kind of in that borderland now as NOAA fishery comes north. We have very few marine resources that the Fish and Wildlife Service are responsible for, but there's some big ones for us. That's like walruses and the bear, polar bear, and seabirds. And I'm just wondering, from my own ignorance, we see Fish and Wildlife, we see NOAA coming. Is there a way that NOAA and Fish and Wildlife are, when they're talking about ecosystem, are you guys connecting the dots? And wonderful. Is that something that will happen more, you think, or just for my education? Because I see the Fish and Wildlife Service up here quite a bit, and we see you
Thanks
guys.
for that. Yeah, thanks for that, Gay. It's a really important question. You've got different federal agencies, as you said. Fish and Wildlife Service focused on walrus and bear. We're focused on bowhead ice seals, and in your region in particular, with lots of overlap, right? Beluga whales as well. Lots of overlap in these species. So the short answer is yes. We do try to work together. The longer answer is not enough. We should work together more. And as we are learning about the changes in the environment, we absolutely are sharing information with each other. The nice thing about the NOAA focus is that because we have the fish component, we're also bringing in that marine ecosystem, that marine environmental component into the whole picture. And that's valuable for all of us. On the other side, where you've got other marine mammals that are using other habitats like the walrus and the polar bears that Fish and Wildlife Service is working on, that's also critical from a predator perspective, from a better understanding of animals that depend on different habitats. It's critical that we compare these species. Some will do better than others with changing habitat. We've seen that. We know that. You all know that. You see it all the time. So absolutely, we work together, and the goal is to continue to do that. And again, try and make it easier on communities to know where to go when they've got questions on the particular species that are important to them.
All right. Well, I'll hold off my other question because I see someone has their hand up already. Rick Toman, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Really nice overview. I wonder if you could maybe just talk a little bit about this whole idea of a broader integration and a broader view of the rapidly changing environment that you've talked about, especially from the NOAA perspective. You know, one of the dreams that some of us have had is a much more integrated Earth systems understanding and forecast capacity. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely, Rick. And really that's a pun intended here, foreshadowing of what we're working on in this region in particular. So for well over a decade, we have worked on a program called ACLIMB. And really this was about taking all of that ecosystem work that I mentioned before, all of the how the ocean interacts with the species, how the species interact with each other, and then build models that help us predict better into the future. So why does that matter? How would we drive that? So the goal is to take climate scenarios and downscale them to the region of the Northern Bering Sea, where we can predict different trajectories. We can predict a very warm environment in the future and a kind of warm environment in the future, and then better predict what that means for the ecosystem. So those models are in their nascency right now, right? So we can just scratch the surface. Let me give you an example. And it's kind of one I gave before, but we can predict based on temperature and the effects of sea ice in the Southern Bering Sea, whether or not pollock 6 years from now will have a successful year class. And that's based on what we know of the plankton, about their fat content, about who eats who, etc. So what if we could do that more broadly with more of the ecosystem? What if we could do that with information from yourself on more refined information on weather patterns? What could we do if we worked with our partners at NOS, National Ocean Service, on how that links in with coastal communities and coastal processes? It starts to get very complex. Will we be able to predict, you know, every aspect of the marine ecosystem? Of course not. Of course not. Folks know from predicting weather that we get better and better and better at it, but we're not perfect at it. And there's a certain point where it's questionable into the future. But if we could even get close to communicate, hey, this is going to be a good sea ice year, a low sea ice year, that would be valuable for communities to understand. If we could even communicate that, you know, our expectations, you know, a handful of months or even a year out, that would allow us to prepare. That would allow communities to adapt. So, Rick, back to your question in particular, this integrated approach is now being templated, if you will. It's being used nationally all over the United States in a program called Climate Ecosystem Fisheries Initiative. And this is an initiative where we're seeking resources. We're building the capacity in our science, in our data collection, in order to pull these pieces together. A key component of this is the communities. A key component is understanding the effects on the communities. It's bringing the socioeconomics that we didn't have in our models before into our models, so that we can take this all the way from the climate into the communities. The hard part, I'm sorry, this is a long-winded answer, but the hard part are those extreme events. And that's where we need to work across disciplines. We need to work with yourself and others who have more information on the communications between what's happening in the atmosphere and the climate weather system to the marine, ocean, and community system. Because it's those extreme events like we saw in 15, 16, like we saw in 19, that are having the largest changes, that are the most impactful.
Great, thanks very much.
All right. Sounds good. There's also a question in the chat. It looks like the Russians have been fishing in the Chukchi, and I'm going to say commercially fishing in the Chukchi. Are there any plans to conduct surveys to support sustained yield fisheries on the US side? And maybe for me, you can, or for others like me, you may not know what sustained yield fisheries are. You can define that for someone like myself. And then are there plans to conduct surveys to support that? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So let me start by saying that the information we have from Russia these days, given the geopolitics and the global conflicts with Russia, mean that the information is very, very limited. We don't have a lot. We do know that there have been increased fisheries farther north on the Russian side. We do know that there has been attempts to ramp up that production in the Chukchi region. What that means is it's more evidence for what our surveys tell us and have told us, that we've seen these species movements. We know that in 2019, cod were all the way through the straits. We saw the pictures from Kotzebue Sound. We've seen those numbers in our surveys in the northern Bering Sea. We have put tags on cod and we can see where they go all over the North Pacific. Same with pollock, same with some of our flatfish species. So in terms of the specific question of, what are we doing about that on our side of the line? We do have, we've moved into the northern Bering Sea on an annual basis now. We didn't do that prior to a handful of years ago, 2017 prior to that. Right now in the Chukchi, we don't have the resources to continue to expand our surveys other than to look at the full ecosystem. So right now our focus is on how is the ecosystem changing? Could the ecosystem support those fisheries? And if so, is it something that we should be worried about? For instance, the Russian fisheries that are occurring. Is there a potential for that to impact our ecosystems on our side? At this point, I would say that it's unlikely that they're happening in a volume big enough to impact us right now in the Chukchi Sea. A lot of that came from what happened in 2019 when we have this just incredible 1,000-mile migration in the order of 12 to 15 months of so many of those species that have mostly come back and settled as the region has cooled off. But what I will say, because there's a lot of unknowns in what I just said, but what I will say is that what that shows us is a glimpse into the future. That one 2019 event really shows us that as these events continue, which they will, we're going to see more and more change in that regard and potentially at that magnitude. Oh, I never answered the question about sustainable yield. So what do we mean about sustainable yield? So the goal in any fisheries management and how we manage the Bering Sea, for example, is we figure out how many adult fish are out there, how many fish they make each year, how many become adults each year, and then how much can we remove from that system. That's yield. How much can we remove? Sustainable yield is how much can we remove so that there's still enough for next year, so that there's still enough for the ecosystem, so there's still enough for the communities that depend on them, while benefiting economically, while providing food to the region, while providing food to the world in some cases with some of our fisheries. So that's a balance. That's the hard part, is to keep that sustainable with change. So now you add in climate change, and that becomes even more difficult.
All right. Thank you very much. That's very helpful and a little concerning, honestly, because we've seen, and I don't know if you've been privy to, but certainly in this region, we were getting, before the Ukraine, sharing this maritime boundary, we often, before the situation we find ourselves in currently, we were able to get information back and forth, and things like walrus show up in walrus. We've got video and photographs of walrus in trawl. That's big bycatch, right? And so it makes you wonder what the Russians are doing, and if we're not communicating that seems rough kind of for this little region. But anyway, very interesting, and thank you for your definition. Dean Stockwell, I see your hand is up as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Nice talk. Really appreciated it. You mentioned that the system is in transition, and I work with phytoplankton, as you know, and I know that HAB species have always been basically present in the northern Chukchi, moving in, or northern Bering Sea, moving into the Chukchi. With the transitions that we're seeing of warmer waters, these events that we're seeing with HABs are becoming more prominent. And the loss of the cold pool, you in fact mentioned that as allowing a lot of the pollock and Pacific cod to move north. You mentioned these things with ice algae being less, feeding the benthos. So the benthos is in transition too. How do you put all this into perspectives with not just next year or 5 years out, but with a 20 to 50 year perspective, saying this system is changing and it's going to have consequences?
Yeah, thanks for that, Dean. Great to hear your voice. It's been a long time. Appreciate that question. It's difficult. 20 to 50 years out, harmful algal blooms, considering them in particular, not only is the warming trend opening up habitat for the phytoplankton species that contribute to harmful algal blooms, but we're realizing in this region that there's also, harmful algal bloom species cysts laying dormant in the benthos that are potentially activated because of the warmer temperatures. It remains to be seen, what the impact in the other parts of the ecosystem will be in the long run. But suffice it to say, there's a very strong likelihood that harmful algal blooms will increase, that will become a part of our, our understanding of how the ecosystem functions. What we don't know is how the ecosystem will progress. How will it change from year to year to year? Because it's not going to just slowly get warm like we had been planning on. We had been planning for things to slowly warm. We had been planning to think about how these environments will slowly get warm and species will move up from the south, and and we'd have a higher probability of adapting. But what we're seeing is that the extreme events are driving some of our issues, and it makes it all the more important that we're monitoring. We must monitor the changes in the fisheries. We must monitor the changes in the marine mammals in the communities. And as you said, the HABs are critical that we're monitoring, so that if there is a quick shift, if there is an event, that we are on top of it.
No, I agree with you fully. The loss, though, of the cold pool, the loss of ice algae coming to the benthos is going to impact all of those animals that graze there too. And your monitoring is essential for that. So I support that wholly. Thank you.
Agree. Thanks, Dean.
And know that we are really nervous for a harmful algal bloom event repeat of last year. We will not have the benefit this year of a research vessel dedicated to harmful algal blooms in the region. And we did sustain a massive, persistent, and dangerous algal bloom from St. Lawrence Island to the southern Chukchi from July to September last year. So we are worried about that return without any kind of research vessel again, which then makes me ask, because one of my other questions was, how do we help you help us? Because we often see the agencies come from afar, and that's just the way it is. And I'm glad NOAA, Fisheries, all of Alaska Fisheries Science Center seems to be reaching out more. And what do we do as communities to the best to help you help us with all these changes underway? What do you need from us?
Partnership. That's the word, partnership. It's going to be really important that we acknowledge that this change is occurring, that we acknowledge that we don't have the resources in Alaska, and you don't in your communities, to go this alone. to collect information, to communicate the needs. So that might be partnering on identifying the relationship of the community to the environment, so that we know who can and can't adapt. It might mean collecting information together, community partnerships and collecting information when, as you say, a ship is not available. How do we work together? Something that we're doing at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center this year. Well, we've been trying this for years and years, but we're finding some success this year, is identifying resources and funds that we can provide to community members to help, so that we can engage and gain information from traditional knowledge, to gain information from citizen science, in order to keep community members involved and help fill the gaps in what we collect. There's also just communicating the changes that you see, so that we can, so you have eyes on the water. You're on the water every day. You're dependent on the water. You see these changes. We come there even in a ship, and it's a point in time. So I think combining that information and being willing to combine that information and share with each other is going to be critical. And again, the word partnership can't be highlighted enough, because there just isn't 100-year history of monitoring, measuring, writing this down with respect to management. So we need to take the thousands of years of acknowledging the change that's occurring, incorporate it into the information and data that are being collected now, so that we can manage into the future.
All right. All right. We have people online from all over. Any questions from, I can see St. Lawrence Island, Nome. Any questions from anybody there to the head of the Alaska Fisheries Science Center?
I have a question.
Go ahead. Orlin,
Just-
you and the caller just lit off. Let me
Oh,
turn it over to the caller first,
ahead.
and we'll get to you. Go
Yeah.
ahead, caller.
Okay, Gay, Bob,
Yeah.
thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe if, this is Gary from native village of Gamble, but, maybe if we created a tight-knit, committee that consists of, knowledgeable locals and students, who are aware of the, impacts of climate change, and you take that committee and you educate them, get everybody on the same page. Maybe that would help, everybody, achieve their goals, and then we'd have a voice.
Thank you,
I think
Gary.
that's a great idea, Gary. And it has to happen at different scales. I think it would be extremely valuable to do that on the community scale in Gamble. We are working with the Northern Bering Sea Climate Resilience Area right now. So that is an entity that was created under the Obama administration and recreated in the beginning. In fact, it was the first executive order from the Biden administration to set up the Bering Task Force, which is an indigenous community task force. Pardon me, that's the government agency half of it, and then the TAC, the Tribal Advisory Committee for that region, which is made up of different tribal entities in the region, to talk together and do exactly what you just said. So that's happening at a fairly high level in the region. But we also need exactly what you're talking about, where we bring students, we bring locals in and educate each other both ways. So, at some point, Gary, I'd love to talk to you more about that. Love to come into Gamble and have that conversation and talk about how we do it better together.
All right.
Yes, thank you, Bob.
All right. Thank you. And Orlin, you guys were on the same wavelength. Orlin, are you still on? Go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I am. What Gary said, I was going to say something like that. And about the algal bloom, how do you know that's here? do you have to sample it, or can you see it, or how does that work?
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways, Orland. Thanks for that question. Mostly you have to sample it to understand what species it is. There are some things we can do from satellites, and what we have to get to eventually is knowing what conditions are right for a harmful algal bloom to be present. In the southern part of the United States, they can actually predict it. Because the temperature and the species that in the studies they've done for years and years, we're just getting started in Alaska because these are relatively new events in that particular region in terms of being able to model. But there is a whole network, harmful algal bloom network. It's a focus of partly the National Ocean Service, partly the National Marine Fisheries Service, and many people collecting samples in order to provide those predictions that you're talking about. The hard part is going back to what Gay said when there's not a research vessel there to make the collections, and that's where it gets more difficult.
Yeah.
So-
The time, what was it, last year, Gay? You guys?
Yeah.
It was out like 20 miles, or how many miles out of the west southwest, right?
Yep, in July,
I do
southwest
a lot of-
of Gamble.
Yeah, I do a lot of camping, and I think it was around that area, but further out. So I get worried what if I eat it or with my fish. And yeah, that's why I asked if we could see it or we could only sample it, right?
So for our region, thank you so much, Orland. That's a really good question. And everybody's kind of concerned. I'm concerned greatly, actually. So we only had the information where that ship went, and they went from Nome over to St. Lawrence Island in July. Then they went up to Utqiagvik. Then they came down back to Nome. And then they decided to redo their entire trail. They couldn't get back to St. Lawrence Island because of weather, but they went on up to Utqiagvik, and everything was kind of on its head. They thought there'd be a big bloom up north in the northeast Chukchi Sea, but it turned out we were kind of the ones that had the danger, and it really was quite a bloom, quite an event, and at a high level. So what we have currently for the Bering Strait region is the Norton Sound Health Corporation. Well done, Norton Sound Health Corporation. They have a program that Emma Pate with the Office of Environmental Health. She's working with tribes. I believe she may be headed to Gamble actually in the next month or two. I may go with her. And Savunga's on board, I think Unalakleet and some of the other communities in Eastern Norton Sound, and that is to get training and equipment, and once a week through the IGAP program, be sampling seawater and start looking at it for the different types of algae. There's lots of good algae. We need algae to live, but this type that we're worried about, or one of a couple of them, seems to like to live when the water's a lot warmer. And that's our scare, is the water's gotten a lot warmer, and this kind that we don't want is around and may bloom. And bloom just means it's going to get the right conditions, like lots of sunlight, lots of nutrient rich water, and lots of heat, like any other plant. Boosh, and it's going to take off and sort of divide its little cells kind of in an uncontrollable growth stage. Poosh. You can't smell it, you can't see it, you can't taste it. This stuff is rough. So anyway, we do need to keep a track on that, and Norton Sound Health Corporation starting that. There's also another project, and this will be going on for the summer. We will be taking here in Nome intestine samples, uncleaned, from down near the anus, about 3 feet of intestine. Both at Savunga, and we're going to be probably asking, we will be asking that again at Gamble and throughout the region. There is the NOAA EcoHab project, which is looking at saxitoxin, that poison in the food chain. Not to go on, but know that we will be at least have that as some sort of a mechanism by which we can test tunicates, seafood, marine mammals. You need to test the UNUC, the fecal matter in the intestine. of whatever it may be, walrus, bowhead, spotted seal, bearded seal, said walrus, but any of those harvested marine mammals. So we have two ways, but they're pretty tenuous and small for what may be on threatening both sides of our region, regardless of the line. Hope that answers that. So stay tuned. There will be more information. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Gabe.
Yep. Go ahead, caller.
Gary from Gamble. Yeah, is there any possible way that we could probably test the crabs as well? You know,
Yeah.
a lot of locals from Gamble and
Yes.
Savunga do
Yes.
a lot of crabbing.
You bet. And it's not the meat of the legs, it's the actual guts, right? So like the crab, if you want to pull the legs off, that's the kind of thing you could send in, is that the body before you cook it. And I wouldn't cook it with the body attached. Kind of till we
So
know
you,
more.
you'd
That's
be
how
the
we
person
eat
to send the
Hungarian.
At this time, yes, I would be receiving those in NOAA. And then I'll talk more about this when Emma and I come to Gamble, because I'm talking to Gamble right now, but I would be receiving those, and then we'd be putting those on like Alaska Air Cargo and getting them down to Seattle, to the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, where they're going to analyze that. But it's not, it's a research project. It takes time. It's not going to be like sugar beans. It's not going to be overnight. So that's not in our favor either. So we're working with what we have. Hope that helps.
Thank you.
You bet. There'll be more information. With really good questions and concerns. We are really worried about this in the region after what we had happen last year. Dean, go ahead.
Yeah, Orlin and the caller were right on topic. And I think that they should make those inroads with Emma Pate and the Norton Sound Health Corporation.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to send a microscope out there if they need that, so they can connect with Emma and at least show her pictures and get somewhat faster time results. Those aren't toxins. Toxins are going to take, you figure you have to send your samples to NOAA. Those samples then go someplace else, and it could take more than a week to know if your samples are toxic. But, you know, I'm willing to help support those groups so Emma can get data and look at it. And so contact her. This is essential for your community's food security. And I think it's something you should look into and talk to with Norton South, the Health Corporation. So thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dean. And we can talk offline. And well done. So this makes me think. So we have Bob Foy, and I'm wondering, you know, when you say you're collaborating and stuff here, you're hearing about an issue. Is this what you are hoping to have more input from us? That's why I was kind of asking, like, how do we help you help us? Is that we voice our concerns to the NOAA Fisheries, Alaska Fisheries Science Center, or what would be the best, what would work for you?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a fantastic conversation. As you mentioned, our partners and it's kind of difficult to explain, but there's a particular researcher at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center that is really focused on harmful algal blooms. We collect samples for her all the time. We work with the National Ocean Service, who's also got a national level focus on harmful algal blooms. We do very little of that work at the Alaska Science Center because we're focused on the fisheries and on the management and the marine mammals. But that's not to say we're not working together. That's not to say we can't. It's not good for us to hear that this is of interest. We pass these messages on to our partners and vice versa regularly. But yes, this is exactly the kind of conversation, the kind of topics where we hear what the changes are, what the needs are, and then get to move forward. And it's this kind of platform that's important. So I mean, this is why Strait Science is so important. You know, we just connected a couple of people. Doesn't matter what the topic is. That's the goal here. So yes.
So we're working.
So Bob, let me interrupt, Gabe. So Bob, this is Dean Stockwell, and I think it would be very important if you could talk to the Alaska Department of Health and say, you don't sample recreational shellfish for toxins. Subsistence shellfish follow under that category. If you could talk to them and say, is there any way we can get shellfish samples from Savunga, Gamble, Kotzebue, up along the coast, tested by the Alaska Department of Health? That would be really valuable if you could do that. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely, Dean. It's an important issue. You know, there's not an adequate sampling program in the south part of the state where there's aquaculture associated with harmful algal blooms as well. And that's probably a resource limitation, I'm guessing. You know, absolutely passing on those messages on the importance of monitoring the HABs, getting samples from these different regions is definitely part of the dialogue that we have.
And I look at it myself, and speak up, Bering Strait region. I look at it myself as if there's a problem with clams, that's a problem for a human being, but that's also a problem for a bearded seal. That's also a problem for a walrus. That's also a problem for an eider duck, you know, and so that's where you get all the confusion of the agencies. But like for the bearded seal part, that would be like a NOAA thing. So those kind of topics, I don't know, maybe yeah, when you come to town next, maybe we can open this up a little wider and bring more in and have a discussion maybe about all the concerns we have in the region. I don't know, region, speak up.
Yeah, this is spot on, Gay. You know, hearing what we think the issues are. It also lets us know where we need to educate ourselves. You know, we don't know everything, and the ecosystem changing, so we can learn from you. We might be able to educate on what we're seeing, and or identify gaps that need to be addressed. And this is the way we're going to be able to do that.
Right. As a public servant of the Bering Strait region, I look towards NOAA in the same vein. You provide us many services, and we need to learn more about that, and we need to be able to help you help us and answer our questions. So I think that's really valuable. Thank you so much for your time tonight. We are over the 7:30 mark. Any other questions for, oh, Rick Toman had written. Now, I'm sorry, Rick, you're still on, but you had similar to climate. Maybe I've lost the train here. Similar to climate in the chat. He says, we know it's going to be much warmer in July than it is in February, but every year the path from February to July is wiggly and never a smooth line. So you wrote that in response to something, and I'm just seeing it now. So I'm sorry, Rick. Do you want to put that in any kind of context if you can remember?
Oh, yeah, that was just, I wrote that when Bob was saying about how, you know, we had been thinking about, you know, a smooth change, but in fact, these extreme events are important. And my comment was just about that we're already used to that in some sense in the environment, that we're, you know, it's never a straight line from the cold of winter to the warm of summer. There's always wiggles, and it's just the same in the marine environment.
Yeah, I think we're going to have a big wiggle with this storm. Sounds like if we've already got open water. Yeah. Oof. All right. So with no other questions, we want to thank you, Bob. And for next week's Strait Science will be on March 2nd. Hard to imagine we're rolling into March 2nd here pretty soon. And the speaker will be Rob Kaler with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he's going to discuss the seabird die-offs and kind of where we are, and he's going to bring us up to speed and get us ready for summer 2023. So buckle in for that, and that'll be next week. I'll be sending out the flyers, and that'll be March 2nd. Bob and Maggie, if you want to stay on for 1 second after, that would be great. And thank you, everybody, for hanging in there. Really good discussion and very interesting, Bob. Thank you so much.